Blood is thicker than water, but greed makes it run cold. When an eccentric shipping magnate died, his arrogant eldest son seized the entire empire, leaving his younger brother nothing but a rusted, empty iron safe. Or so he thought. What lay hidden inside would shatter their family legacy forever. Rain lashed against the towering, reinforced glass of the Abernathy and Carmichael law offices in downtown Chicago, mirroring the bleakness settling heavily over Thomas Harrington's chest. Across the sprawling mahogany conference table sat his older brother, John. Unfazed by the somber occasion, John casually flicked an invisible speck of lint from the lapel of his bespoke charcoal Brioni suit. He checked his platinum Patek Philippe watch with an exaggerated flick of his wrist, letting out an audible rattling sigh that echoed inappropriately in the quiet room. He had a first-class flight to Saintes, Bart's to catch by 4 o'clock, and this formal reading of their father's last will and testament was to him simply an irritating bureaucratic delay. Their father, Gregory Harrington, had built Harrington Global Freight from a single rusted barge on Lake Michigan into a logistics empire worth hundreds of millions. But wealth had not insulated him from the ravages of early-onset dementia and a subsequent brutal stroke. For the last 3 years of Gregory's life, Thomas had effectively paused his own promising career as a structural engineer to become his father's primary caretaker. Thomas was the one blending meals, administering medications, alongside the private nurse Abigail Fisher, and sitting up through the agonizingly long nights when Gregory forgot his own name. John, conversely, had spent those 3 years leveraging his title as vice president to fund a lavish lifestyle of Monte Carlo casinos, impulsive real estate acquisitions, and endless strings of high-profile, disastrous public relations scandals. John only managed to appear at the estate when he needed his trust fund replenished, and he had treated their father's funeral the previous week like a networking event, handing out embossed business cards beside the open casket. David Abernathy, the family's estate attorney of 40 years, cleared his throat. He adjusted his half-moon spectacles and looked down at the thick, cream-colored document. He seemed to avoid Thomas's eyes. "If we may proceed," Abernathy said, his voice a dry rasp. "The estate of Gregory Arthur Harrington is vast and complex, but the directives of his final testament are explicitly clear. I will summarize the primary distributions as instructed." Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't want the money for yachts or penthouses. He just wanted the crushing medical debts he had incurred out of pocket to keep his father in his beloved home to be cleared. He wanted security. "To my eldest son, John William Harrington." Abernathy read the heavy parchment, rustling. "I leave all controlling shares of Harrington Global Freight, the primary family estate in Lake Forest, all liquid capital held in the primary accounts at Chase and Morgan Stanley, and the entirety of my stock portfolio." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow to the ribs. The breath left his lungs. All of it. The company, the house, the cash. John didn't even try to hide his triumph. A slow, venomous smirk spread across his tanned face. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Naturally," John murmured, looking directly at Thomas. "Dad always knew who had the killer instinct to run the board. Sorry, Tommy. It takes a shark to swim in these waters, not a nursemaid." "John, please," Abernathy interjected, though his tone lacked any real authority. The lawyer turned the page, finally meeting Thomas's devastated gaze. "There is a secondary provision. To my youngest son, Thomas Edward Harrington, I leave my deepest gratitude for his presence in my twilight hours. Furthermore, I bequeath to him the entirety of the contents of my personal basement study at the Lake Forest estate, specifically the 1926 Mosler double-door floor safe and any and all items contained within it." Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. "A safe," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. John burst into genuine, booming laughter. He slapped the mahogany table. The Mosler, that monolithic piece of rusted garbage in the sub-basement. God, the old man really did have a sense of humor at the end. That thing weighs 2 tons, Thomas. It hasn't been opened since the Reagan administration. It's a giant paperweight. "It was your grandfather's," Abernathy said, quietly addressing Thomas. "Gregory was very specific. You are to take possession of it immediately. You've got until Friday." Tommy John sneered, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "I'm having the whole Lake Forest house gutted and remodeled starting Monday. If that rusted monstrosity isn't out of my basement by then, I'm paying a scrap crew to chop it to pieces with blowtorches. Consider it my final charity to you." John didn't wait for a response. He snatched his umbrella from the stand, nodded curtly to the lawyer, and strode out of the office, the heavy oak door slamming behind him with a terrifying finality. Thomas sat frozen. 3 years of sleepless nights. 3 years of watching the man he loved fade away. And his reward, while his arrogant brother walked away with $250 million, was a rusted iron box. He felt a sickening mix of profound grief and boiling anger. His father had been eccentric, sometimes, harsh but never cruel. Why would he humiliate Thomas like this? Abernathy slid a small sealed manila envelope across the table. "This contains the combination, Thomas. I am truly sorry." Gregory's mind was slipping toward the end. I tried to counsel him against amending the will this way, but he was adamant. He drafted this final version himself. Thomas took the envelope, the paper feeling heavy as lead in his hands. He didn't say a word. He just stood, turned up the collar of his worn trench coat, and walked out into the freezing Chicago storm. 2 days later, Thomas stood shivering in the unheated, poorly lit confines of a cheap rented garage unit in the industrial district of Pilsen. The air smelled of motor oil and damp concrete. Getting the safe here had nearly bankrupted his remaining checking account. He had to hire a specialized heavy rigging crew, 2 massive men, named Hector and Vince, who used a reinforced hydraulic lift and a steel dolly to extract the 1,500-pound iron beast from the Lake Forest estate. John had actually stood at the top of the basement stairs, drinking a scotch, laughing as the movers struggled, shouting mock encouragement down at them. Now the 1926 Mosler safe sat in the center of the concrete floor, like a dark, silent monument to Thomas's failure. It was an imposing piece of machinery standing 4 feet tall, constructed of forged steel and thick iron plating. The black enamel paint was chipping, revealing patches of rough orange rust. Heavy iron rivets lined the edges, and a massive brass combination dial sat dead center between the 2 heavy doors, tarnished green with age. Thomas pulled the manila envelope from his coat pocket. His fingers were numb from the cold, and his heart pounded with a desperate, pathetic sliver of hope. Maybe he thought, maybe there's a trust deed in here. Maybe a stack of bonds. Dad wouldn't leave me with nothing. He wouldn't let John take it all. He ripped the envelope open. A single slip of aged, yellowed paper fluttered out. Written in his father's shaky left-handed scrawl were 3 numbers, 42, 17, 88. Thomas knelt on the freezing concrete. He placed his hand on the cold brass dial. He took a deep breath, the vapor pluming in the frigid air. He spun the dial to the right, clearing the mechanism. Right to 42. The heavy internal tumblers clicked with a satisfying metallic thud. Left past 42, stopping at 17. Another heavy click. Right to 88. Thomas gripped the thick iron handle on the right door. He pressed his thumb against the latch release, and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, a harsh metal-on-metal shriek that echoed off the corrugated tin walls of the garage. The heavy door swung open, revealing the dark interior. Thomas reached into his pocket and clicked on a heavy-duty tactical flashlight, shining the bright LED beam into the cavernous space. He stopped breathing. It was empty. Thomas swept the beam frantically across the steel shelves, top shelf empty, save for a thick layer of grey dust. Middle shelf empty. Bottom compartment empty. There wasn't a single document, not a dollar bill, not even a family heirloom. It was a hollow, rusted void. No! Thomas choked out, dropping to his hands and knees. He shoved his entire torso into the safe, running his bare hands over the cold steel shelves, frantically searching for a hidden envelope, a false backing, anything. His hands came away coated in decades of black grime. He pulled himself out and sat back on his heels. The reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. It was a joke, a cruel, deliberate final punishment from a father whose mind had been corrupted by illness. Or worse, John had somehow accessed it beforehand and stripped it bare, leaving the heavy shell behind just to torture him. Tears of pure frustration and betrayal welled in Thomas's eyes. He grabbed a heavy steel wrench he had brought with him and slammed it against the side of the safe with all his might. Clang! The sound was deafening, vibrating up his arm. "Damn you!" Thomas screamed into the empty garage, his voice breaking. He swung again, hitting the floor of the safe's interior. Thud. Thomas froze. He blinked, the tears blurring his vision. He gripped the wrench tighter. The first strike against the side wall had produced a high, ringing metallic clang, but the strike against the bottom floor of the safe had produced a dull, hollow thud. He wiped his face with the back of his dirty sleeve and grabbed the flashlight. He shone the beam directly onto the floor of the safe. It looked like solid steel plating painted black, seamlessly matching the walls, but as Thomas leaned in closer, bringing his face inches from the metal, he noticed something. The dust. The thick layer of grey dust was perfectly even across the top and middle shelves. But on the floor panel, there was a hairline fracture in the dust, a perfect rectangle about 2 feet wide and a foot deep running along the edges of the floor plate. Heart hammering against his ribs, Thomas reached out and tapped the floor panel with his knuckles. Hollow. 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 It wasn't a solid floor. It was a plate. He frantically scoured the edges with his fingers, tearing his fingernails on the rough metal, looking for a latch, a keyhole, anything. There was nothing. It was fitted perfectly flush. "Come on," Thomas muttered feverishly. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver and a hammer from his toolbox. He wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the microscopic seam at the front edge of the steel plate. He raised the hammer and struck the back of the screwdriver hard. Sparks flew. The screwdriver bit into the rusted seam. Thomas struck it again and again, driving the metal wedge deeper. He felt the resistance give way slightly. He dropped the hammer, grabbed the handle of the screwdriver with both hands, and pried upward with all his body weight. With a sickening crack of breaking rust and ancient adhesive, the heavy steel floor plate violently popped upward, catching Thomas in the chin and knocking him backward onto the concrete. He didn't care about the pain. He scrambled back to the safe, shining the flashlight into the newly exposed cavity. It was a false bottom. A hidden compartment nearly 6 inches deep, entirely concealed beneath the heavy iron floor. And it was not empty. Sitting in the center of the hidden recess was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. Next to it lay a heavy ring of antique brass skeleton keys, a velvet pouch, and a sealed envelope made of thick, expensive stationery. But it was what lay beneath those items that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. Stacked neatly in the bottom of the compartment were dozens of pristine, bundled documents. They weren't cash. They were bearer bonds, certified stock certificates for shell corporations Thomas had never heard of, and heavy notarized property deeds spanning across Manhattan, London, and Zurich. Thomas reached out with trembling hands and picked up the sealed envelope. Written across the front in his father's strong, steady handwriting from years before the illness had taken hold were 3 words for Thomas only. "Will you survive the truth?" Thomas broke the wax seal, unaware that the contents of the letter would not only instantly make him wealthier than John could ever dream, but would expose a dark, dangerous secret their father had buried decades ago. A secret that John's newly inherited company was built directly upon. Dust danced in the stark beam of the flashlight as Thomas unfolded the heavy cream-colored stationery. His hands shook, leaving faint smears of decades-old soot on the pristine paper. The familiar, commanding handwriting of Gregory Harrington seemed to leap off the page, carrying the authoritative boom his father had possessed before the stroke silenced him. "My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, it means my mind finally betrayed me, and John took the bait. I know how this looks. I know the humiliation you endured at Abernathy's office. For that, I am profoundly sorry, but it was the only way to protect you, and to protect the true legacy of our family from your brother's incurable greed. John believes he has inherited a kingdom. In reality, he has inherited a graveyard." Thomas blinked his brow, furrowing, as he read the next paragraph. 4 years ago, before my diagnosis became public, I hired a private forensic auditing firm out of Geneva. I suspected John was mismanaging his division, but the truth was far more cancerous. Your brother has spent the last decade using Harrington Global Freight as collateral to fund his grotesque lifestyle. He set up shadow accounts through Julius Baer and took out massive, highly illegal, leveraged loans using fraudulent shipping manifests. He essentially hollowed out the company from the inside to cover catastrophic losses in offshore derivatives. When I discovered this, the company was already drowning in hundreds of millions of dollars of toxic debt. If I had fired him or gone to the authorities, the ensuing scandal and SEC investigations would have bankrupted us, leaving you with absolutely nothing and dragging our family name through the mud. So I played the fool. I let John believe his embezzling was undetected. But quietly, methodically, I began extracting the remaining clean, untainted capital. I liquidated my personal stock portfolios, sold off our international patents through anonymous proxies, and converted the family's true wealth into untraceable, decentralized assets. Everything in this false bottom belongs to you, Thomas. There are $50 million in unregistered municipal bearer bonds. The deeds beneath them are for 3 commercial high-rises in London's Canary Wharf, fully leased and managed by Cushman & Wakefield under an ironclad blind trust. The velvet pouch contains flawless investment-grade rough diamonds sourced from Antwerp, completely off the grid. But the most important item in this safe is the black ledger. It contains every wire transfer, every fraudulent signature, and every illegal margin called John ever authorized. It is his financial death warrant. I leave you not just a fortune, but a choice. You can take this wealth disappear and live the peaceful life you sacrificed to care for me. Or you can wait for the margin calls to hit Harrington Global and use the ledger to take back what is ours. I love you, my son. You were the only one who stayed. Thomas slowly lowered the letter. The silence of the freezing Pilsen garage was deafening, entirely at odds with the hurricane of realization tearing through his mind. He wasn't a disinherited outcast. He was a ghost billionaire. He reached into the hidden compartment and lifted the heavy black ledger. He flipped it open. Page after page of meticulous, damning evidence stared back at him. Account numbers routing codes to the Cayman Islands, falsified invoices from phantom logistics contractors. Gregory had documented everything. John hadn't just stolen from their father. He had signed his own name to a financial time bomb. And according to the final pages of the ledger, a massive balloon payment on the Julius Baer shadow loans was due precisely 3 days after the estate settled. Thomas looked at the stacks of bearer bonds, the cold steel of the false bottom, and the rusted shell of the Mosler safe. A slow, chilling realization washed over him. John's inheritance wasn't a victory. It was a perfectly designed, inescapable trap. Carefully, Thomas packed the bonds, the deeds, the diamonds, and the ledger into a heavy canvas duffel bag he had brought for his tools. He zipped it shut. He didn't feel the biting cold of the garage anymore. The crushing weight of grief and betrayal that had suffocated him for days evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call Abernathy. The old estate lawyer was either complicit or incredibly incompetent. Instead, Thomas searched for the premier corporate litigation firm in Chicago. He needed a shark. Sirens wailed in the distance as John Harrington stepped out of his chauffeured Maybach, adjusting his designer sunglasses against the harsh Tuesday morning sun. He had returned from St. Bart's prematurely, deeply irritated. His platinum American Express card had been unceremoniously declined at a high-end marina, and his calls to the Harrington Global Accounting Department had gone straight to voicemail. He strode through the revolving glass doors of the corporate headquarters, expecting the usual flurry of deferential nods from the lobby staff. Instead, he found chaos. Men and women in austere grey suits were methodically moving through the ground floor, carrying cardboard bankers' boxes. 2 uniformed federal marshals stood by the elevator banks. "What the hell is going on here?" John barked, grabbing the arm of a passing junior analyst. "Who are these people?" "It's the SEC, mister." Harrington, the analyst, stammered, looking terrified. "And auditors from Deutsche Bank. They froze the primary accounts at 6 a.m. Something about a default on a heavily leveraged offshore margin. Calls a payroll bounced today." John's blood ran cold. The shadow accounts. But that was impossible. The old man was dead, the estate was settled, and John was supposed to have access to $70 million in liquid capital to cover those loans. He shoved past the marshals and took the private executive elevator to the top floor. He burst into the mahogany-paneled boardroom. Sitting at the head of the massive glass table, casually sipping a cup of black coffee, was Thomas. Standing behind Thomas was a formidable woman in a sharply tailored navy suit, Helen Rostova, a senior partner at Chicago's most ruthless corporate defense firm. "Thomas." John hissed, his face flushing with a mixture of confusion and sudden blinding rage. "What are you doing in my building? Get the hell out of my chair." "It's not your building anymore, John," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. And according to the creditors currently tearing apart the accounting department, downstairs you don't even own the chair. John marched toward the table, slamming his fists on the glass. "I am the sole controlling shareholder. Dad left me everything. Once the estate liquidates those Chase accounts, I'm clearing this up and having you arrested for trespassing." "There is no money in the Chase accounts, John," Thomas replied, leaning back. "Dad emptied them over the last 3 years. He funneled it all into offshore bearer bonds, unlisted real estate, and diamonds. He moved the real wealth out the back door while you were busy taking out illegal loans against a hollowed-out company." John froze. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a sickly, pale dread. "You're lying. The will?" The will gave you the company, Thomas interrupted, sliding a thick file folder across the glass table. A company that is currently $300 million in debt. Dad knew you were embezzling, John. He knew about the Julius Baer accounts. He knew you were sinking the ship, so he handed you the wheel and took all the lifeboats. John's hands trembled as he opened the file. Inside were photocopies of the black leather ledger, his own forged signatures, the illegal wire transfers, proof of every crime he had committed over the last decade. Where did you get this? John choked out, his knees buckling slightly. He slumped into a chair, the designer suit suddenly looking too big for him. In the rusted piece of garbage in the sub-basement. Thomas said, his eyes hard and unforgiving. Dad left me the safe. He knew you wouldn't bother to check it properly because you were too arrogant. You thought it was an insult. It was actually the entire Harrington fortune, legally and cleanly separated from this sinking ship. Helen Rostova stepped forward, placing a single pristine contract on the table in front of John. The SEC is downstairs, Helen said crisply. They are about to discover the extent of your fraud. You face roughly 20 years in federal prison. However, my client is offering you a singular act of grace. John stared at the contract, his breathing shallow and erratic. What is this? It's a complete surrender of your remaining equity, your title and your rights to the Lake Forest estate, Thomas said. You will sign it all over to a new holding company which I control. In exchange, I will use my private capital to quietly pay off the Julius Baer debt before the SEC realizes the extent of the shadow accounts. The criminal investigation goes away. The company quietly restructuring debt is a bad PR day, but it's not a federal crime. You want me to walk away with nothing? John whispered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. You already have nothing, Thomas corrected him. You have toxic debt and a prison sentence. I am offering you your freedom. You keep the clothes on your back, you walk out of this building, and you never contact me again. John looked at his younger brother. He searched Thomas's face for any sign of hesitation, any remnant of the soft, compliant caretaker he had mocked just days prior. But there was only the cold, unyielding steel of a man who had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged victorious. With a shaking hand, John picked up the Mont Blanc pen from the table. He signed his name on the dotted line, effectively erasing himself from the empire his father built. He stood up, avoiding Thomas's gaze, and walked out of the boardroom a broken man. Thomas stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling streets of Chicago. The rain had finally stopped, and the morning sun reflected brilliantly off the skyscrapers. His father's legacy was safe. The debts would be cleared, the company rebuilt the right way, and the true fortune secured. The Mosler safe had indeed been empty on the surface, but it had held exactly what Thomas needed, the leverage to claim his destiny. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and hidden family secrets, smash that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this dramatic twist with your friends, and let us know in the comments what you would have done with the safe subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life storytelling videos. We drop new incredible dramas every single week.